Why is Easter important? Well, because Jesus rose from the dead at Easter, we respond, and we rightly say the Easter greeting, Christ is risen, he's risen indeed. But why is that important? What does it mean to say that? In our reading, John is showing us the key things that flow from Jesus' resurrection and what Jesus' death means in the light of his resurrection. John offers us a message to share with others, power to share that message, and then answers to honest questions. Let's look at those three in turn. Let's start with a message to share. What are the results of Jesus' death and resurrection? Jesus is alive. It is me, he says. He's come back from the grave. He's entered into a new kind of life. That's why he can pass through locked doors, verse 19. Jesus is not just a great figure of history like Julius Caesar or Winston Churchill. He's somebody who is alive now. We can know him on our experience because he's alive. And that produces joy. Great joy. Rejoicing. We rejoice, don't we, when somebody we love comes back from being away. When my wife Ali is away for a few days, well, I should say when she was away in normal times, then I miss her because I don't see her and I can't spend time with her in person. And as we've discovered through the pandemic, talking on the phone or Zoom isn't really the same thing as being in the same place physically with somebody, is it? The disciples' joy is greater than that, because they had never expected to see Jesus again. They knew that dead people don't come back. Sometimes you hear people say that ancient people were naive and it wasn't strange for them to believe that somebody came back from the dead, and that's just modern ignorance. Ancient people knew that dead people do not rise. That's why they were both surprised and overjoyed when they saw Jesus. The presence of Jesus then and now brings great joy to those who trust in him. And then there's peace. Twice Jesus says, "Peace be with you," to the group on that first Easter evening. What's peace? It's not just gooey feelings in your stomach. The peace Jesus is talking about is peace with God. And that's why Jesus repeats the greeting. The first time in verse 19 it could just seem conventional, the standard Jewish greeting still today, Shalom Aleichem. But the repetition in verse 21 then says there's more to it than that. And if we look back in John's Gospel, we see that peace is significant because it leads to lack of fear, to not being troubled. In 14:27, Jesus says, "Peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you. I do not give you as the world gives. Do not let your hearts be troubled, and do not let them be afraid." And then in 16:33, Jesus again says, "I said this to you so that in me you may have peace. In the world you face persecution, but take courage, I have conquered the world." Jesus in his death and his resurrection has conquered all that the world could throw at him. That peace with God comes through the cross. Notice verse 20, where Jesus shows them the marks in his hands where the nails went through his wrists and his side where the spear pierced it. It's the cross, it's his death that brings that peace. And then there's forgiveness. In verse 23, whoever sins you forgive are forgiven. Jesus doesn't criticize the disciples for abandoning him. Of these men who are in the room with him, only one, the beloved disciple, stayed with him at the cross. He stood there with Jesus' mother, watching him die. But they are now forgiven people. even though they failed Jesus. And that's going to be spelled out for Peter in the next chapter, John chapter 21, as Jesus 3 times asks whether Peter loves him, corresponding to the 3 times that Peter said that he didn't know Jesus. Because of the death and resurrection of Jesus, the past is dealt with. It doesn't control our lives anymore. We can be forgiven by God for our past lives. We can be restored to be the people he intends and calls us to be. Forgiveness is available through the death and resurrection of Jesus. And then there's that great moment where Thomas kneels before Jesus in verse 28 and says, "My Lord and my God." This verse is the high point of John's Gospel. It's the point towards which the book has been leading and driving. Because Jesus has come back from the dead, he's no mere human being. He is Lord. That means he's the one you serve and you follow. He's God. He's the one you worship. Now that's an astonishing thing for a Jew who believes there's only one true God to say. That's an astonishing thing to say. But Jesus' resurrection and Jesus' physical appearance to Thomas has convinced him. The other good things which God gives flow from recognizing Jesus. And that takes us to verse 31. Because John is writing these things so that you might know that the Messiah's Jesus, and that in him, through him, you might have life. Life is what follows from believing in Jesus as Messiah and Son of God. New life, eternal life, life of a different quality entirely. It's a favourite theme of John. John uses the word life 36 times in his Gospel, which is far more than the other Gospels. So in John 10:10, Jesus brings abundant life, life in colour, not black and white. Christians experience that sort of real life, where all the greens look greener, all the reds look redder. I'm old enough to remember watching snooker on TV in black and white. And it was really puzzling when the commentator said the green's behind the brown, because you weren't sure which one was the green and the brown in black and white. The first time I saw snooker in colour, it was a complete revelation. Now that's the difference the life Jesus brings to us. It's abundant life. It's overflowing life because of his resurrection. So remember that most famous verse, John 3:16. God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that those who believe in him should not perish, but have eternal life. A new dimension of life now, which will go on beyond death and is not defeated by death. John 17:3 explains this further. Eternal life, Jesus says, is to know the one true God and his Son Jesus Christ in experience. And that's something we can do now. But it's more than that. John 5:24 says that believing in Jesus means that you have eternal life, and so you won't face God's judgment at the last day. Freedom from fear of judgment and its positive replacement, abundant eternal life, is what we have. Now that's spelled out in terms of life beyond death in John 6:40, for instance, and John 6:54. To believe in Jesus means that you have eternal life, and that means you'll be raised again at the last day. The one who believes in me will rise again at the last day, says Jesus in 11:25. Life after the last day. life in abundance. That's extraordinary. And if you eat Jesus' flesh, according to Jesus in 6:51, then you'll have eternal life and never die. Now that's not cannibalism. Eating Jesus' flesh is an image for trusting him, taking him into your system and making him part of you. Now isn't that wonderful? Isn't that good news? Jesus then sends the church, the disciples in verse 19, to share this message with the world in verses 21 to 23. They're to go and tell others. Now that's about all of us being called by Jesus to live and share the message of Jesus with others, not just those who are ordained. The Church of England's ordination service makes this passage its reading for an ordination. And that's fine, providing you understand it as being addressed to the whole church and not just to the ordained. And the disciples don't start doing that very quickly, because in verse 25 they tell Thomas. And then John himself says in verses 30 and 31 that he's writing to share the message with his readers. I'm writing these things so that you may know the Messiah is Jesus, and that through him you might have eternal life.